The UK is marking 10 years since its dramatic exit from the European Union. At a time of growing anti-European sentiment, Prime Minister David Cameron staked his 2015 election campaign on a vote to decide the future of Britain's EU membership, despite opposing the idea himself. A bill to hold the vote was introduced almost immediately after the Conservatives' victory, with the poll set for June 2016.
Early legislation will be introduced to provide for an in-out referendum on membership of the European Union before the end of 2017.
The Brexit campaign proved incredibly divisive. Just days before the vote, MP Jo Cox was murdered by a far-right terrorist, prompting a brief pause in campaigning. By the 24th of June, Britain delivered its answer, voting to leave the EU with a slim majority of just under 52%.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
A day after the result, David Cameron announced his plan to resign. The referendum proved to be the easy bit, with the implementation taking half a decade. The result drove a wedge between Europe and the UK, despite right-wing populism surging on the continent.
I said that I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union. You all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you?
Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it. Brexit means Brexit.
I'm very clear Brexit does mean Brexit. As he says, we will make a success of it.
Brexit then claimed the career of David Cameron's Tory successor, Theresa May, who lost her parliamentary majority when a snap election backfired. The loss of control in Westminster and tense negotiations with the EU led to her resignation in May 2019, just 2 months after the Brexit process finally began. The so-called bulldozer of the Brexit campaign, Boris Johnson, would finish the job, but not without his own battles. The transition period officially ended in January 2021. 10 years on from the referendum, the country remains split over the issue. Well, Jill Rutter is a senior fellow at London-based think tank, the Institute for Government. She led its Brexit team after the referendum. I spoke to her a short time ago.
Legacy of Brexit. British people have taken back control. That was one of the promises. We can now decide our own policies in areas where before we were subject to EU rules. However, one of the problems is that quite a lot of people don't like some of the policy changes or policy choices that our governments have made. So if you voted for Brexit thinking it was going to bring down migration, net migration has come down quite a long way in the last year, but it did reach absolute record levels quite shortly after the UK left the EU. So some people feel that promise wasn't delivered. In other respects, you know, people who thought this would lead to the UK being able to forge lots and lots of new trade deals, done some of those, Australia and New Zealand, but they haven't landed a big trade deal with the US. That was one of the things that people held out. And I think one of the things that we've been most disappointed by is Brexit has not proved the answer to solving the UK's poor economic performance, which we've really seen since the global financial crisis. And it's not therefore led to having lots more money to spend on improving public services. And that was one of the big promises in the Brexit campaign.
And I mean, you know, everything comes back to the economy. Where is it at and how much of that can we attribute to Brexit?
So there are arguments from economists. Most mainstream economists still think that Brexit has been bad for the economy, that the hit to the economy compared to what would have otherwise happened to the economy is between 4 and 8% over the longer run. And that we've seen most of that come through. So the economy's definitely performed significantly worse. One of the big problems that we've got in the UK is that since 2019, not all down to Brexit, because we've also had COVID, we've also had the Russian invasion of Ukraine and consequently very high energy prices, is that living standards really haven't budged. And we now have a very high tax burden as well. So the tax burden is at record levels.
How has Brexit reshaped politics?
We now have really very different politics. People may no longer be voting on the Brexit issue, but how you voted on Brexit really does now seem to determine where you're going to go. So basically, the right bloc in British politics, so Reform and the Conservatives, are mainly Leave voters. Remain voters now vote Labour, a Liberal Democrat, or increasingly for the Green Party. So we've got two big blocs, still sort of Leave, Remain, or the issues that determined whether you were Leave or Remain. And the fight we're now seeing in British politics is within those blocs. So we have a fight for who dominates the right bloc. At the moment, the Reform Party, Reform UK, are polling significantly ahead of the Conservatives, though not necessarily converting that into parliamentary by-election wins, though they did really, really well in our local council elections. In the left bloc, Labour is now facing real competition, real loss of votes from the Green Party under a leader who was elected last year, has moved the party significantly for the left. It's now a very different party to the party it was at the time of the Brexit vote.
If we look at the seat of Makerfield, the new MP, Andy Burnham, set to be the new British Prime Minister, they had a strong Brexit vote there, and the rough polling there looked about 65%. Where are attitudes and opinions at there? I mean, have they shifted in a place like that over the last 10 years, given the results that we saw in the last few days?
Makerfield looks like a really classic Reform seat. It was a seat that I think was about number 10 on Reform's target list. So of the seats they would be looking to win at the next election, they would win that if they'd gone up to, under 20 MPs. So they've got about 8 now. So it really, really was prime Reform territory. Because it's got all the characteristics of a Leave voting seat. So it's white, it's older, quite working class. So those, education, ethnicity, those are sort of some of the issues that affect how you're going to vote. And Makerfield is prime Reform territory. But the people in Makerfield were offered a really, really interesting choice. They had, as a candidate, the very, very popular Mayor of Manchester, part of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. And they knew that if they elected Andy Burnham as MP for Makerfield, he was going to go and try to remove the very unpopular Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. So quite a lot of people may have decided to vote for Andy Burnham on that basis. I think where you're right, is Andy Burnham cannot be guaranteed he will win Makerfield at the next election. I mean, he's going to have his work cut out to convince the people of Makerfield that he's really done a great job of turning around Labour to ward off what will be quite a big threat from Reform in that election.
So is there anything that most surprised you about what has happened over the last 10 years?
I think the interesting thing about Brexit was that the Brexiters deliberately didn't have a plan for what Brexit meant and actually was so unclear about what Brexit meant. And it took so much time to work out what Brexit would mean. There's just been a documentary on the BBC about Brexit, and the final shot is of Boris Johnson, who was the sort of political figurehead, if you like, of the Leave campaign, saying, we didn't think it was our job to have a plan. And I think what I didn't really expect was that we would spend the next, 5 years after Brexit trying to work out what Brexit meant, that it would so dominate every other issue. And basically, since 2016, British politics has been successfully knocked off course. We spent 5 years arguing about nothing but Brexit. Then we had the pandemic that preoccupied us for couple of years, and then we've been sort of focused on Russia, Ukraine, the changing geopolitical situation, the consequence of President Trump's re-election. So it's been a really sort of preoccupying, distracting period. Meanwhile, it's been really difficult for successive governments to get to grips with lots of the underlying problems of the British economy, British public services, the British state, which you might say actually were the real drivers of the dissatisfaction that led to Brexit rather than our membership of the EU itself.
Jill Rudder, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
You're welcome.